Things cannot stay the same, or they will rot and go bad, become unuseful or harmful. But if we allow them to change, to be broken down, to ferment, to become something new, it will not only preserve and persevere, but be useful, often healthy, sometimes a little merry, and grant us new energy to carry on. In death, destruction, decomposition, and decay, something new is born, created, that has the ability to survive the harshest and most desolate of conditions.
Greetings from the Pacific Northwest. You're listening to Symbolic Studies Episode 12. I'm your host Mario, once again joined by my lovely wife Michelle. Today we'll be discussing the symbolism of Capricorn, the 10th sign of the zodiac. If you're new to the show, I have regular contributors and invite guests to submit a voicemail on the topic at hand. And I also play voicemails submitted by listeners like yourself. For more information about the show, my services, or how to submit a voicemail, please visit symbolicstudies.com. If you'd like to have access to exclusive content, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/symbolicstudies or on my site. But before we dive into the first voicemail, Michelle, my dear, how are you?
I am doing great. Feeling nice and cozy, actually, with Capricorn season upon us. This is my zodiacal sun sign. I identify pretty strongly with Capricorn, as you know, and Saturn. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing our insights, hearing what our guests have to say, as well as just reveling in the season and taking in the coldness that's here now. We've got a really nice burst of cold weather out here in the Pacific Northwest, and it finally feels like winter, actually. We've had a very mild winter up until this point. So now we're actually below freezing at night, which I welcome with open arms.
Yes, indeed. I know you like the cold weather. You appreciate it. And for that reason, I do call you an ice queen. And so your birthday is going to be coming up around the corner, and just have to say, we really both bonded over Capricorn symbolism and Saturn symbolism as well for a number of years. This is something that has been just a routine topic that we always come back around to, even when it's not Capricorn season. So I'm really excited to dig into things and see what everyone has to say. To kick things off, we got a voicemail from a woman I first met after we recorded our Lost Lore of Saturn live streams a couple of years ago. Not only is she a Capricorn sun sign, but she also is writing a book on Saturn. So of course, I thought it was only fitting to invite her to contribute something for Capricorn season. With all that said, here are some insights from Kristine Backes.
Capricorn, here we are in Capricorn season. Capricorn might be one of the most maligned signs in pop astrology today. When we think of Capricorn, we often think of its shadows, uber responsible, uber corporate climber, somebody who is authoritative and trying to control everything. Those are some of the distortions that we get with Capricorn. And as we'll talk about, many of them come from the distortions of Saturn as well. But who is the real Capricorn? What is the real Capricorn? Although it's often talked about as a mountain goat, the actual symbol of the sign and the constellation of Capricorn is the sea goat, the goatfish. It's a goat with a fish's tail crawling up out of the ocean. It's bringing spirit, water, into matter, earth. It's bringing ideas from the unconscious down underneath the surface of the ocean up onto land, into form. Capricorn and the goatfish are the great manifester. That's the purpose of Capricorn. As the last earth sign, it has to do with material reality and maturity of working with material reality. It's about mastery. So Capricorn's a cardinal earth sign, which also makes it a feminine sign. And we're going to unpack each of those. And as I said, it's also the last earth sign. So as a cardinal sign, it initiates, it begins something new. And Capricorn comes in the tropical zodiac. Capricorn begins at the December solstice, when the sun has reached the southernmost point of its journey from north to south. The Capricorn begins as the sun stands still for 3 days at the Tropic of Capricorn, before then turning and moving back north towards the Tropic of Cancer, which it meets in June. So that cardinal sign gives it a sense, a flavor of initiating, of beginning something. And as I said, it begins the season. And as you know, the solstice is also a time of rebirth. So there's that dual meaning of decay and death, and also beginning and creation of something new, and the rebirth and renewal that comes with the sun reaching that point, especially for those of us in the northern hemisphere. And then when we look at the earth piece of it, the earth sign, it's one of the 3 earth signs in the zodiac. This is about the material realm, the ground, what we can see, touch, feel. It has very much to do with the world of the 5 senses. And then as the last earth sign, it has to do with mastery. So Capricorn has to do with wisdom. It's the sign of the elder, not the elderly, but elderhood, the wise elder, the wisdom that comes from living on earth for some period of time. In the shamanic astrology paradigm, Capricorn has to do with the wisdom of the indigenous grandmothers or grandfathers. It's that natural wisdom, indigenous wisdom, again, the wisdom that comes from the earth. Whereas Aquarius, for instance, also a sign of wisdom, has more to do with the social wisdom. Saturn rules both Capricorn and Aquarius. Capricorn as a feminine sign, and again, not female. It's easy to confuse that in our culture today. You could think of it as yin. It's also sometimes called negative versus positive, nocturnal versus diurnal. As a feminine sign, this is a more inward-looking sign. And of course, as it comes at that beginning of winter, this is a time of hibernation and a time of incubation. Like this is when the seeds are being incubated by the earth. And again, with Saturn as the ruler of both Capricorn and Aquarius in traditional astrology, this gives you the sense that Saturn has a feminine face, and this is the feminine face of Saturn. So one of the archetypes I like for Capricorn is the crone and the wise woman. That's, again, they're both very earth wisdom centered, and they both show mastery of the earth realm, but in that indigenous way, in that way that carries true wisdom of experience. So some of the shadows and the distortions that we see of Capricorn and thus of Saturn are the structure that is Capricorn becomes rigidified, and mastery turns into authority in which we have control over something rather than understanding the real truth of how to co-create with something. We get into achievement, climbing the mountain, right? That the distortion of Capricorn as the mountain goat rather than the sea goat, where we're just trying to achieve for achievement's sake. And then again, mastery is control. And in our culture, where power is confused with control, that becomes a common distortion of planets such as Saturn, signs such as Capricorn, because we don't understand that power is the power of creativity, and that mastery is the ability to co-create, not control. Another distortion of Capricorn, and that also gets associated with Saturn, is that work has to be hard rather than work being something that's intrinsic to what we do as embodied beings. It's action that we take. And so that's the other piece here, is that this is talks about intrinsic integrity is the way you might put it. Capricorn and Saturn both have the sense of being about integrity. Capricorn is associated with the knees, but also the skeleton, the internal structure, as well as the skin, the external boundaries. And Saturn rules those things as well. And so rather than thinking about being in integrity with some external standard, the true expression and true intent of Capricorn is about being integrity with your center, with your soul, with yourself. So as you think about Capricorn and you think about its rulership of Saturn, what you might do is start to think about how would words like commitment and responsibility and mastery and authority and respect feel different if you knew they were coming from the inside out rather than imposed upon you by external. And one example is respect. That's a word that's much associated with Saturn and Capricorn. And in fact, one of the challenges of somebody with a sun in Capricorn or a lot of personal planets in Capricorn might be feeling respected, really feeling like you get respect. Those of us that have sun in Capricorn and a lot of Capricorn energy are the ones that as children are always trying to get respect from our elders, and so we always act older than we really are. That might not apply to everybody. It certainly did to me. And yet, as you mature and become more true Capricorn, you realize that respect comes from the inside. So the challenge of Capricorn, as well as Saturn, is self-respect. Again, that integrity with one's own self, one's own knowing, one's own center. So if you'd like to know more about Saturn or want to follow my work, Saturn is one of my specialties. I'll be talking a lot about it this year. You can find me. I'm Kristine Backes. I am the host of the Natural Wisdom podcast, and I help people reclaim their natural wisdom. So you can find me on Substack. My publication is Reclaim Your Natural Wisdom. You can find me online at KristineBackes.com, and you can listen to the Natural Wisdom podcast. Thanks for the time, and thank you, Mario, for the opportunity to contribute.
All right, Kristine, thank you so much for submitting that voicemail. I was really excited when she said she was interested in bringing something to the table. If you guys want to hear Kristine and I talk in depth about Saturn, we recorded an episode on her podcast a couple years ago, and I think we had an excellent conversation about everything. And some of what she brought to the table here today relates to some of what we discussed. And I like the fact that she brought the word distortion into the mix, these distortions with Saturn, which there's several. And one of them is, in fact, the idea that Saturn is more masculine in today's world. You know, in the modern world, we generally think of Saturn as an old man with a beard, and then he has a scythe, and then he's eating a child, something along these lines. He has an hourglass or what have you. And to me, this is one of these things where it feels as though the way I can say it is that there's been a fall from grace with Saturn. And I think that this relates to the idea as well that a lot of people have said over the ages that Saturn was the ruling planet of the last golden age. And also that it was viewed as more than likely, perhaps more feminine, although we are going to listen to some callers who say that it's actually more neutral, kind of like Mercury, how Mercury is an androgynous planet. So that is one distortion, that there is a very, very strong feminine dynamic here with Saturn that's often overlooked in today's world, I would say. And to me, it's interesting, though, that a lot of people know that Saturn relates to restrictions, limitations, boundaries. And I would say as well, and obviously a lot of other people say this too, but like contraction, right? Things actually kind of going into themselves, not expansion. When we think of expansion, we're generally thinking of Jupiter. When we're thinking of contraction, we're thinking of Saturn. When you compress something or something is going into itself, it reaches the center. And so everything is being compressed towards that center, which is different from expansion, which is an emanation from the center. To me, this is fascinating because there is a lot of symbolism associated with Saturn that corresponds with the center. In fact, the way I look at it is that it seems as though perhaps under the old system, Saturn may have been the first planet that really was conceived or created and also became the first elder as such, almost like a family. The firstborn is going to be the first elder in the family of that generation. That is what we're talking about with Saturn, in my opinion. And I think that the rings of Saturn kind of relate to this. So because of this, I think that there's been a lot of distortions over the ages because it's been around for such a long time. It's like an older person, this older person that you might see in front of you in their teens versus their 20s versus their 40s versus their 60s versus their 80s. They're going through a lot of changes. And so to me, this is kind of how I view Saturn and why there sort of are these misconceptions with what it represents. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying our discussion on Capricorn symbolism so far. If you aren't already aware, I have a series called Symbolic Secrets that's only available on my site or via Patreon. At the moment, I'm releasing one episode for every major arcana card and have released 18 so far. That's about 18 hours worth of exclusive content. Links for everything can be found at symbolicstudies.com. Or if you want to go straight to Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/symbolicstudies. This is the perfect way to support the show for only $5 a month. And this also gets you early access to every podcast, like the one you're listening to right now. All right, back to the episode.
Great points all around. And boy, was it nice to hear from Kristine, because I really appreciate her perspective. I, too, was able to interview her when I was doing the Healing Home show, and I was also a guest on her show. And, I really just took a fondness to her view of Saturn because of all the things that she laid out there. And to come back to the Golden Age topic, I have a quote from the Zodiac and the Salts of Salvation, and it states, "The Golden Age was the name given by the ancients to the time of Saturn's reign." So there we have it, also in text, just confirming what you're talking about with this original source.
Yeah, well, there you have it. And one of the things I think about from one of my favorite teachers, Rene Guénon, he says that during the Golden Age, people were more centered. That was normal. That was common. People had an understanding of what was sacred. People had this spiritual alignment that we don't really see today. And so if we're ever going to return to a golden age, people are going to return to their center. That's a whole entire thing. And so here we have Kristine talking about integrity with your center. And so for me, one of the interesting things about it is that when I refer to my center or your center or just the concept of the center, oftentimes I bring the pole into the conversation. And so when someone is off-centered, I might say that they've lost their pole. Or if somebody becomes centered, I say that they found their pole, right? It's this point of pivot, this orientation. And I just have to say there's a lot of polar symbolism that relates to both Capricorn and Saturn. And if you want more insights on that, I really suggest people check out our Lost Lore of Saturn series. So if you go on my YouTube, you can check that out. But absolutely, I love what she's saying about the inner, not the outer sort of dynamic. That whole entire weave resonates very strongly with me. And the symbolic aspect of the goat climbing the mountain is finding your center. That's why the mountain has basically been related to spiritual enlightenment, awakening, things of that sort. So I can co-sign with so much of what Kristine said. And I think that this was a great way to kick off the episode.
I agree. And one of my bigger takeaways from Kristine's voicemail is the concept of respect and Capricorns sometimes not feeling like they're being respected and that being a theme for them. And I can relate to that wholeheartedly ever since I was a little girl. Or even if it wasn't that I felt like I wasn't being respected, I would have a sense of feeling left out or feeling misunderstood a lot of times. And this has been something that I've had to work on continuously throughout my life and even into my older years of the realization, and you, babe, helping me come to these conclusions as well, of it's not about the respect outside of you. It's the respect or lack of respect that you might have for yourself that's making you feel like you're not respected or you're not being acknowledged, or these sorts of more negative emotions that come along with that. And I really can appreciate her bringing that up, and also can relate to what she said about sometimes Capricorn sun signs have a tendency when they're younger to want to be older or to maybe look towards older people or being associated with older people. And this would make sense considering the themes of the elder that's associated with Saturn and Capricorn.
Right, exactly. And one of the things I'll say before we move on to the next voicemail is the fact that the goat has often been viewed as like an old god, a very primordial god. And to me, this makes sense for a lot of different reasons. And there's a number of myths around the world that kind of highlight the goat in this way. That the goat is in and of itself very, very ancient. That's how people have viewed it, at least. And so the fact that there are these elder themes with Capricorn and Saturn, I think the goat is like a perfect symbolic match for all the things that we're talking about.
Happy New Year, Mary and Michelle. Great to be back with you as we explore all things to do with Capricorn season. But firstly, I need to recognize the Capricorn in the room and wish Michelle a happy birthday and many blessings upon her solar return. So let's dive into it. Capricorn is a cardinal feminine earth sign. As we learned in Libra episode, the word cardinal stems from the Latin word for hinge or axis. Coincidentally, Capricorn rules the knee in medical astrology, the knee being a hinge point that supports the weight of the upper body. So too do we have occurring at this axis the time the sun stands still for 3 days, leading up to the solstice day or the Yule. After the 3-day standstill, the sun turns on this axis to be reborn, with the days of sunlight growing longer. This brings me to the Saturn glyph, which looks like a curly letter H with a cross at the top. There is this inverted S-shaped curve with the smaller loop or hook at the bottom, which some attribute to the sickle, which to me sounds like cycle, or the shepherd's crook. But to me, it reminds me of the solar analemma, just half it. The analemma is an asymmetrical figure 8 pattern that the sun traces in the sky. The solstices are marked at the midpoints of the loops. So in the northern hemisphere, the bigger loop is at the bottom, denoting winter solstice, while it's the reverse for the southern hemisphere. In fact, it's the observation of the solar analemma which the ancient peoples would have used to precisely calculate the solstices. Just over 2,000 years ago was when the sun at solstice was in the sign of Capricorn, which tropical astrology maintains today. However, if we actually look at the sky in current time, the solstice occurs in the constellation of Sagittarius due to the precession. This is why today, the winter solstice on the 21st of December is aligned to the galactic center of the Milky Way. And I find it kind of ironic that Capricorn is a feminine earth sign ruled by the planet Saturn, which is often portrayed as this old man with a long white beard, usually identified as Cronus or Father Time, the Lord of Karma, who brings law and order and structure. It is said that the zodiac, and I've said it before, is androcentric, and this is why I like to bring to the table the feminine aspect of each sign. For too long, the feminine has been either erased, overlaid, or outright denied, and balance needs to be restored through remembrance. The reality is that all matter in existence is not possible without the dance between the electric, masculine, and the magnetic, feminine fields. We must accept that both complementary aspects reside in every zodiacal archetype. So maybe if time is personified, then cyclical time is embodied in the feminine, as after all, the first clock was the woman's body, while linear time is a more masculine construct, in my opinion. But I believe both can still coexist simultaneously. Circling back to the solstices, particularly winter solstice, is devoted to the mother, like we see remnants in the pagan Yule tradition of Mudranicht, or Mother's Night, which occurs the night before solstice, and that is in remembrance of our female ancestors and maternal powers or forces that governed birth, survival, and kinship. So here in Capricorn, encoded in folklore, myth, and fairy tale, we find the archetype of the great mother goddess, the grandmother, the hag, the crone, the shamaness, the healer, the wise woman, the witch, the skeleton woman, the nuns, the fates, the fatas, who shaped destiny, and the Baba Yagas, who tested and initiated you. Before there were paternity tests and written patriarchal marriage laws, the lineage was traced through woman. The mother was the law. And I can't tell you how many times I've been called mean mummy. And I see this aligning to the medical astrology as well, where Saturn, as ruler of Capricorn, governs the body's skeletal structure, namely the bones, joints, teeth, skin, hair, and nails. This reminds me of the indigenous folklore tales of the skeleton woman. And teeth, bones, and hair are what remain long after the body's decomposition, but they all preserve in them the mitochondrial DNA, which, as we know, is only passed on by the mother and is used in forensic DNA testing even today. Saturn, and by extension Capricorn, encodes the matrilineal, the mother lineage. After all, life begins with the mother, and the further back in prehistory that we go, we find through the archaeology and the anthropology an understanding of the source of creation and cycles, with the thousands of female form figurines known as Venus figurines found in every corner of the world. Some that have been found even date as far back as 40,000 years ago. The earth, as mother in her cycles of creation and destruction, seemed to be a common held belief among prehistoric peoples. We even find the oldest, what's believed to be shamanic burials, the oldest discovered, have all been female. The saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, comes to my mind. Hence, why I think suppressing, manipulating, distorting, and controlling the feminine, women, especially their bodies and fertility, has been pivotal in patriarchal rule to this day. Capricorn, or the goatfish constellation, marks the transition in the sky whereby we enter what is termed the waters of the sky, or the deep, with mostly aquatic-themed constellations. I'm going to reserve the symbolism of the fish for when we are in Pisces season, as there is a lot of overlap, but I'd like to share how I understand or break down the goat symbolism. The myths surrounding the goatfish are very vague and a bit scanty, so I'm going to use primarily an auxiliary constellation that shares a lot of goat symbolism. In ancient Mesopotamia, this was the constellation known as Mul-Uz, or the she-goat. In Akkadian, the name was Enzu, En meaning priestess and Zu meaning to know or deep, as in like deep waters. This constellation is now what we refer to as Lyra, the harp, whose brightest star is Vega, which happened to be the pole star about 14,000 years ago in the last ice age. This constellation, the she-goat, was associated with the goddess Gula, meaning the Great One, not to be confused with the Sumerian god Enki in the sign of Aquarius, which we'll come to next month. But Gula is usually a term referred to throned goddesses. And Gula in Mesopotamia has been called many, many names, too many to name, but I will point out a few, namely Baba Gula, Baobo, and Kabuba, but always associated with healing, medicine, childbirth, and pregnant women. And among the iconography of Gula was the shepherd's crook, dogs, and goats. Dogs were associated with healing through probably the observation of how licked wounds healed. And it's something I've always heard from growing up as well. My mom used to tell me that. And in fact, dogs' tongues contain histatins, which inhibit infections. It's even been suggested that baobo was an onomatopoeic word for bow wow, or bark of dogs. Maybe the same could be said of baba as the sound of goats. It makes me wonder if the Slavic Baba Yaga is a descendant of Baba Gula, as we also find dogs and goats linked in the myths of the Baba Yaga. And one of the myths credited to the Capricorn constellation comes from the Greeks, surrounding the birth of Zeus or Jupiter and his mother Rhea, whose consort is Cronus, who hid him in a mountain top with a nymph or nanny goat named Amalthea. It becomes obvious to me in such myths that goats were acting in the capacity as a wet nurse. After all, goat milk is the closest to human breast milk and a much gentler milk than cow's milk on an infant's gut. In fact, the etymology of Amalthea is tender goddess, related to milk, amelgan, nourishment, and abundance. And I'd imagine if you were a midwife in ancient times, chances are you'd keep nanny goats handy as wet nurses. And I also find it's funny that a baby goat is referred to as a kid. And the goatskin aegis of Zeus, I've read it's been based on a goatskin apron worn by medical priestesses, which was trimmed with cowrie shells, which resemble the V of the vagina, a reminder of the sacred gateway of life. And Capricorn is famously referred to as the gateway of the gods. And when we think of the wise woman in myths and folklore, the Fates, the Fatas, the Fae, the Morai, the Nuns, who shape destiny of both gods and mortals, cutting the threads of life and death, maybe these were the midwives presiding over the birth, the life and death, the cutting of the umbilical cord. And speaking of spinners and weavers, I want to briefly touch on the Greek Orphic cosmology. In the Orphic tradition, time is personified by Kronos, spelled Chronos, and his consort and sister is named Ananke, which translates as force, constraint, and necessity. And I think it's funny, Ananke reminds me of the West African myth of Anansi, the spider. Anyway, Ananke in the Orphic tradition, she's depicted with a spindle and a serpentine body, while her consort Cronus is a winged serpent, and both of them are coiling around the cosmic egg, crushing it to release first light, their son, Phanes, who Zeus later consumes. It can be confusing, this whole Cronus, Cronus, and Kronos, Chronos, and it confused me for a time as well. But Cronus, Cronus, is the Olympian titan whose sister and wife Rhea gave birth to the gods, including Zeus. My time is running up, so I'm going to end it here. But thank you again for letting me share some of my musings on this sign of Capricorn. And if anyone wants to find me online, feel free to check out my Substack, The Venus Diaries, or my main website. And Happy New Year to everyone listening. And thanks again, guys.
Okay, Katriena, thank you once again for another awesome contribution to the show. I like what you had to say briefly about the sickle being related to cycle, and that you said they sound similar. I completely agree with you on that one. Makes a lot of sense that would be associated with Saturn and therefore Capricorn, the end of the calendar year, beginning of the calendar year, etc. And I just wanted to mention one of the things, because I see so much northern symbolism. That's my thing, right? With all of the planets and all of the signs, when you look at Ursa Major, it kind of looks like a sickle. And I've heard that this is a connection that's been long lost, is that the sickle has this correspondence with the constellation Ursa Major, which has 7 stars to it as well. I'm inclined to think, since I'm bringing it up, that this is where we get the glyph for the number 7 as well, the actual symbol for the number 7. And wouldn't you know it, in the traditional system, Saturn was the 7th planet as well. And speaking of sickles or cycles, I like what you had to say about woman being the first clock. Really well received and appropriate for the sign. And I appreciate your passion, too, with bringing the feminine into the conversation with all of the signs. And I know you had something to say about this as well, right?
I'd like to say thank you, Katriena, for the birthday wishes. I appreciate that. Also, the woman's body as the first clock. That really stands out to me, makes a lot of sense. And it makes me think of menstruation and childbirth and then menopause, and how a woman's natural cycle is a great way to track time. Any woman out there who follows her cycle knows this and understands that it can be like clockwork if everything is running smoothly. The other thing that comes to mind with this is a quote that I also have again from the Zodiac and the Salts of Salvation. They say, Saturn is the sower of seed. In fact, he or she is the seed itself. This kind of points to what we're talking about with just childbirth, menopause, menstruation, this whole natural cycle of creation. And Saturn itself being the natural creator.
Excellent stuff. And when I think of the seed, I often think of the egg.
Nice.
And when I'm thinking of the egg, in terms of it relating to Capricorn or Saturn, I think of the shell of the egg and how Saturn relates to boundaries and limitations, partitions, walls, things like that. And so when we're thinking of the egg, whether it's the cosmic egg or an actual egg or the seed, I think of basically that external shell that keeps everything in, but then also keeps everything out. And so this is something that we've kind of talked about a couple of times lately. Saturn, as it relates to this boundary dynamic, it just as much keeps things out as in. And so on one level, it denies, but then it's also inclusive on another level. And so I would say vessels, all containers, have this Saturnian sort of dynamic baked into it with whatever its walls or parameters are that keeps everything nice and safe in there. I also love the fact that Katriena is paying attention to hinge symbolism, point of pivot symbolism, as it relates to the knee being a hinge. And this really relates to axial symbolism as well, which I've talked about in several presentations, but that was all really well received.
Well, this also makes me think of the kneecap and then Capricorn and how the knee is mobile in different ways. Yes, it's a hinge and it allows us to squat and jump and walk and do all sorts of amazing things. But when one's leg is outstretched, you can grab your kneecap gently and you can kind of move it around really easily. And it kind of also shows to me that, yes, there's a lot of structure with Capricorn, but I feel like there's also a lot of mobility too. And the mobility comes from when I think about the aspect of climbing or
swimming.
Yes, swimming. That's another good one. So the movement and the fluidity of Capricorn is also very prevalent. And this can sometimes be overshadowed with more of the structural, hard attributes that come along with it.
Rigidity is what most people think of, right?
Yes, totally.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And when you think of the goat too, they get into like so much trouble and they know how to get into things. And there's just constant movement with that. They're not one of these idle sorts of creatures, right? They're moving about, they're climbing, they're doing all of these things. And so I think you're right. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Yeah, they're also natural landscapers because that's one of the reasons why people will get goats for a property, particularly if they're trying to clear land. You can get goats and pen them in an area where you want the landscaping to happen, and they will take care of it.
Hello, Mario and Michelle. This is Sarah. I just have to say it was absolutely fabulous getting to meet you guys in person finally. And today we are talking about Capricorn, the symbol I have lovingly named the Lord of Heights and Depths, the Master of Fear. It's a composite creature like Sagittarius, and these are the only two in the zodiac who are these composite creatures that are made from two different things. And in Capricorn, we have the goat and the fish. We have the front half of the body being the shape of the goat and the end being the tail of the fish. And this symbol has been around since humans began to mark things in stone. It's existed since the ancient Mesopotamians. And here we see the goat, who is one of the few creatures able to ascend to the highest heights, mountaintops, inhospitable and dangerous terrain. They are incredible creatures that both defy logic and gravity. while showing a level of balance and dexterity that we rarely see in any other creature. And they do this all without any type of fear. And then the aspect of the fish, we see a creature that is able to plumb the deepest, darkest depths of the sea. We have a creature here that is able to scale to the top of Mount Everest or even Mount Meru, the mountain of the gods, and descend to the hidden depths of the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean, like the Mariana Trench. And how appropriate for a sign who is represented by the devil card in tarot. For who else in all of human lore but the devil has been present both in heaven and in hell, the highest of heights and the lowest of depths. This sign and its corresponding tarot card represent the mastery of fear, facing our fears, mastery of the devil and desires within ourselves. And it's a sign that also hints that sometimes our greatest heights, our greatest achievements, our greatest strengths are oftentimes an inverted mirror image of that of our lowest lows and our weaknesses. The glyph for Capricorn, its symbol or sigil, has 3 prevalent iterations. This is the most of really any of the signs. And it's oftentimes symbolized by a cursive V, N, or even Z, followed by a swooping, curling tail, sometimes often looking like an S, but almost always creating a circle in the glyph. It appears almost like a vessel upon the sea, or perhaps a sharp tooth inside the mouth of Saturn, devourer of his children. Now, the alchemical process for the symbol of Capricorn is fermentation, fitting for the time of Saturnalia, which typically began on the 17th of December and ran to the 23rd. So everyone raise a glass to Bacchus, Pan, Dionysus, and all the horned gods of this time. We're all pretty familiar with one of the more popular end products of the process of fermentation, and that would be ethanol, alcohol. But fermentation has actually been used by humans for thousands of years as one of our oldest means of preserving food. So not only does it preserve, but it also creates, and often creates incredibly healthy foods that provide probiotics that improve overall health and digestion, things such as kimchi and sauerkraut. And so this process, it preserves food that would typically spoil, mold, or go bad through the long and dark winter months. So it was a way for us to keep food from going bad. But also in the breaking down of these components, they reduce to simpler forms. The original substrate is transformed into something new while also creating useful byproducts upon the way. Transformation and creation from destruction. Now, fermentation is a type of anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic means without oxygen, and Louis Pasteur called it la vie sans air, meaning life without air. And it is here that we encounter glycolysis. Now, this is the process where glucose and other sugar molecules are broken down, catabolized, releasing energy and allowing particles to be transferred to other molecules. Now, anyone who's ever worked with yeast to make bread, beer, mead, has witnessed this process occur. And we all know yeast loves sugar. And following that anaerobic glycolysis pathway, it breaks the sugar down and into the 2 predominantly main components, ethanol and carbon dioxide. And this is what causes our dough to rise and our beverages to intoxicate. Now, fermentation is also related to the putrefaction stage of alchemy, the negretto, or the blackening. Putrefaction is the fifth stage of death. It is decomposition, decay, the breaking down of organic material while releasing chemical energy. For even in death and decay, there is energy transfer. And to quote the first law of thermodynamics, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it merely changes forms. For once the biological maintenance of a living organism stops, a chemical chain reaction begins by breaking material down. But in order to preserve and last through darkness, the coldest of winter and the dark night of the soul, it requires a change. And this is where we apply this process alchemically to ourselves. We consider the breaking down of beliefs, core values, ways of thinking, acting, and behaving. And we break them down into individuated components to create something new, or to encounter useful byproducts along the way. When we break things down into their raw individual components, it allows us to analyze, to improve, or to discard in order to preserve core useful components for the long haul. But these often require change. Things cannot stay the same, or they will rot and go bad, become unuseful or harmful. But if we allow them to change, to be broken down, to ferment, to become something new, it will not only preserve and persevere, but be useful, often healthy, sometimes a little merry, and grant us new energy to carry on. In death, destruction, decomposition, and decay, something new is born, created, that has the ability to survive the harshest and most desolate of conditions.
All right, Sarah, thank you for the voicemail. And of course, the pleasure was all ours getting to meet you recently. That was fantastic. We had an awesome conversation. I feel like we could have done that for a whole weekend or longer. And perhaps we'll have a chance to do that at some point. If so, I'm looking forward to it. But there's some great stuff here. One of the things I wanted to mention, you just mentioned the horn gods. Absolutely. It's their time of year. Even I'll say with Sagittarius, some of the older versions of Sagittarius, he has horns. That makes a lot of sense. And I just want to mention that Capricorn, that the corn in Capricorn is related to horn symbolism, if I'm not mistaken. And so cornucopia, as an example, is the horn of plenty. And the horn naturally relates to phallic symbolism. And so there's a lot of power in horned animals and horned gods. And we have the word horny as well, right? And so you could see the natural correspondence with the phallus and the horn. And goats are known for being very lusty. You know, that's kind of one of their things. The devil is known for being lusty. So it's a complete weave with the corn and the horn symbolism. Also, I really love what you had to say about fermentation and how this would relate to winter and getting through the winter. And I just want to let people know, too, if you've never seen the set of 4 seasonal glyphs that I believe were German in origin, if I'm not mistaken. But the glyph for winter looks like a little storehouse, like a grain house, like a granary or something. And so it looks like a little dwelling or a building of some sort. Very, very simple. These are very simple glyphs. But there are little dots in that house. And some people have said this is like a granary, essentially. So getting through the winter, making sure you have the appropriate foods around and whatnot makes a lot of sense. But really, I am no fermentation expert. I will say, however, my wife, Michelle, right here, has done a bit of fermentation herself, and this is more of her wheelhouse. So I'm curious to get your take on all of that.
Well, thank you. And yes, I do enjoy fermentation and have experimented with quite a few things. And I really enjoyed, as always, that Sarah brought the alchemical side of the sign to the table. One of the things that came to mind with this is the act of aging. The act of aging something is what we're doing with fermentation. There's other, chemical reactions and things happening, but really it's an aging process. And one of the things that I always remember about Capricorn, or what can sometimes be said about Capricorns in general, is that they tend to age like a fine wine, or they become better with age. And this goes along with the fermentation or the storing of food. Or if you have a wine or a mead, it's always said that the longer you have this wine or mead, the better it gets. So it's almost like marinating in its own juices. It's definitely transforming over time. And if you hold on to something long enough, depending on what it is, you might have one of the most fabulous drinks you've ever tasted in your life because you waited 10 years to enjoy it, So it's that patience thing that I think also comes along with Capricorn and Saturn, is that it's a slower moving planet. It's a slower moving element in terms of even just when I think of lead, it's a heavy. And so there's something to be said about this whole process and what that looks like and why it relates so strongly to Capricorn and the winter.
And Sarah actually submitted 2 voicemails this go around, so here's part 2.
Now, returning to the Devil Tarot card, and I am looking currently at the Rider-Waite deck. We see the image of a goat-like creature, but with a human torso and almost an animal that's kind of shaggy, kind of furry in the lower half, and bird-like feet, sitting upon a pillar with bat wings and goat's horns. And attached to the pillar are very loosely chained a male and a female human. But what's very interesting to note about these two is that they both have horns. Little tiny horns that almost look like little goat's horns and tails. Now, looking over to the deck, the Tarot of Marseille, an early 18th century deck, we see a very similar depiction. We see a figure of the supposed devil upon a pillar and 2 loosely chained human-type entities. And here they almost have goat ears or deer-like ears and stylized horns that almost look like antlers, very serrated type horns. And again, looking at the inversion tarot deck, we see the same thing. We see a devil-like figure atop a pillar and 2 loosely chained human-type beings, a male and a female, both with horns. And then looking to the black tarot deck, once again, we have a central pillar along with 2 other pillars. And we have the devil-type figure, very goat-like in the middle. And then in this deck, instead of humans, we actually have deer loosely chained to the central altar where the devil stands, and each one is upon its own pillar. And we have a doe and we have a stag. So we keep seeing this recurring theme of these figures having horns, the male and the female, who are loosely chained to the central pillar. And this card brings to mind also the card of the Lovers, who are a male and female human standing oftentimes with an angel behind them. But here in the Devil card, we have the devil figure. And through my research, I stumbled across a Jewish ritual and tradition that sort of seems to explain or depict what we're seeing here in these cards. Kind of a stylized version of it. And that is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Now, in the 3rd book of the Torah, the Vayikra, and in Leviticus 16, it explains what this ritual is. And this ritual was to atone for the people of Israel, to cover them for their sins, and also for the high priest to be able to enter the holy place, to make a way, to cleanse the way, to enter behind the veil to the most holy of holies. And for this ritual, it required 2 goats. And this ritual is also where we get the term and the understanding for scapegoat. Now, there was also a bull and ram involved in the ritual, and this was for the cleansing of the priest himself, and also as offered as a burnt offering. But the 2 goats were very specifically used. And it states, he is to take the 2 goats and place them before Adonai, which is basically the verbalization of the Tetragrammaton, at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then Aaron is to cast lots for the 2 goats, 1 lot for Adonai and the other for Azazel. Now, Azazel is only mentioned here throughout Leviticus or the Vayikra in the Torah, and never really mentioned again. And there's been a lot of speculation on who this entity was. And later on in medieval times, we begin to see it be associated with the devil or a vast number of fallen angels. But here, there's really no explanation other than that 1 goat was to be dedicated to Adonai and the 2nd goat to Azazel. Aaron is to present the goat whose lot fell to Adonai and offer it as a sin offering. But the goat whose lot fell to Azazel is to be presented alive to Adonai, to be used for making atonement over it and by sending it away into the desert or the wilderness for Azazel. This is the scapegoat. Now, the goat for the sin offering is to be slaughtered, ritually sacrificed, and its blood used inside the curtain, behind the veil, and used to make atonement in the holy place, to open the way to the holy place, and to be used to basically cleanse the way to be able to interact with God. And when the atoning of the holy place is done, he is to present the live goat. Aaron, who is the high priest here, is to lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the transgressions, crimes, and sins of the people of Israel. He is to put them on the head of the goat and then send it away into the desert or into the wilderness with a man appointed for the purpose. The goat will bear all their transgressions away to some isolated place, and he is to let the goat go into the desert. Now, in rabbinical Judaism, they go even further to explain this ritual that the 2nd goat, who's to be dedicated to Azazel and released into the desert or the wilderness, was actually taken up to a mountain peak, up to one of the highest mountains, and then fastened a scarlet woolen thread to the head of the goat for Azazel. And after taken up to the precipice, the goat was then to be thrown off the mountain. And it was said that once the goat fell, if the sins were forgiven for the people, the red thread tied around the goat would actually turn white as a symbol that the atonement was complete and that they were indeed forgiven their transgressions. Now, what's interesting is there is also another ritual that parallels another practice that was present in Ebla, in ancient Mesopotamia. But this practice of sending a goat into the desert was actually performed during royal weddings. And it's found in 2 different ritual texts in the archives of Ebla. And the goat used for the Hebrew people they were actually two male goats, but in this specific ritual for royal weddings, there was a male goat and a female goat, a she-goat. And the she-goat had a silver bracelet hung from her neck, and then she was driven forth into the wasteland or to the desert. But in these rituals, there's no mention of Azazel. But I just found that was quite interesting, how it almost parallels the imagery that we see here in the devil card, especially since the devil is supposed to be symbolic of our deepest rooted, darkest desires, that of sin or transgression, or even thought of as the very first one to sin, or the origin and originator of the concept of sin. And here we see a male and a female loosely bound to it with little horns, almost like goats. Is there a correlation? Perhaps. I'll leave you to decide that. Thank you guys. Bye.
All right, Sarah, thank you so much for the second submission there, getting into the scapegoat and the devil card. Really interesting stuff. I had not heard some of these details, like with the red thread turning to a white thread, sometimes with the goat being led up the mountain. Symbolically, that's really potent. I hadn't really considered even the word scapegoat before, but the sk in scapegoat reminds me of a few other words that we're kind of talking about today, as in skin. We've mentioned skin being related to Capricorn, our bones or our skeleton, our skull being related to Capricorn symbolism. I've gotten into the sk words before during Scorpio season, most notably, so I think that's kind of a curious sort of thing. And also, I just want to mention the whole dynamic of the two people on the devil card being loosely chained. I've always interpreted that as basically they actually have the freedom to leave whenever they want. And so if you are in your own sort of personal hell, it has something to do with your own doing or something along those lines. You are an active participant in being there. In actuality, they can leave whenever they want. And so that's how I've always seen those loose chains there. And the Rider-Waite version does illustrate that very well. Hey there, it's Mario once again. I wanted to take a moment and let you know that I am available for tarot readings, private lessons, and graphic design services, which is actually what led me to Symbolism to begin with. Long story short, if you think I can help you with your symbolic journey, or you're in need of symbolic assistance for your business, get in touch. Should you be interested, all those services can be booked at symbolicstudies.com. All right, back to the episode.
And speaking of the devil, one of the first things that came to mind was a book I have by Corinne Boyer, which is entitled Plants of the Devil, where she goes into plants and their association with the devil, particularly poison plants, plants that have thorns that typically are used for protection and these sorts of things. I wanted to read a short quote from her book here. We generally find plants having physically painful attributes, such as thorns or spines being linked with the devil. We also find many poisonous plants bearing his name. Plants that were ill-omened or attracted misfortune certainly belong to him, and those that were used against his evil forces are also found in his lore, used to protect from his malign influence. One of the other things she goes into later on in the book is how in folklore, the devil is often associated with hardship. And one of the things that this made me think of is the life lessons that we get, like the hard life lessons. Those are typically associated with Saturn. At least that's what I associate them with. And I think lessons in general usually come along with Saturn. So it kind of just further illustrates this connection with the devil and Saturn and sort of the, thorny parts of life or the painful parts of life that, as we've talked about before, in the moment feel very strenuous or daunting or what have you, but actually they're there for a great reason so that you can actually kind of like begin anew and you can learn something from the pain and then you can transcend that pain.
Well, it's really interesting because I used to say that every lesson really is a Saturnian lesson. I say that less these days, but I think there's a lot to be said about it still. And one of the things with that is if boundaries and limitations are ruled by Saturn, then you can almost think as every problem in life, every sort of lesson, I guess, that you have to experience is almost like a proximity situation, meaning you got too close to something or you're too far removed from something. A basic example would be you accidentally get pricked by a thorn. You got too close to that plant. You didn't realize that it would hurt that much. You didn't realize it had thorns or little prickers or what have you. You put your finger in a fire. You got too close to that fire. So you're going to learn a very painful lesson with that, right? And sometimes in life, you are too far removed from something that also is a lesson that you need to learn. As an example, maybe there's a friend or a family member, a lover, what have you, that you haven't talked to in months or years that you wish you would be in communication with, you know? So I think a lot of Saturnian lessons have to do literally with being too close to something, too close to a lifestyle, too close to a habit. It could be any number of things. It could also be physical, as we're kind of implying with the thorns and everything, or you're too far removed from it, you know? And so you can imagine that that can take on all sorts of different looks and what have you. So I think Saturn is there when it comes to proximity between you and everything else, basically. Are you too close or too far removed from a situation, a person, a circumstance, what have you?
Very well said.
Hi, Mario. Hi, Michelle. Happy winter solstice season and Capricorn season. This is Emily Ridout at the International School of Astro Yoga, calling in to talk to you about Capricorn energy. So in the tropical zodiac, Capricorn initiates at the winter solstice. This starts winter in the northern hemisphere, and it is the cardinal energy of Earth. This means it directs the earth-based energy, and Earth as a solidification of the other three primary elements is the slowest element to move. So Capricorn energy has an association of being quite steady. But aside from that association, I actually think Capricorn is a very misunderstood sign for a number of reasons. The first of those reasons is that Capricorn is the goat. I think a lot of people know that. It's also the sea goat or the sea serpent. And it's also this energy of the dragon that's sometimes associated with it in esoteric systems. And you can see that by the sea monster association into the dragon. So this energy, when we think about its association with the sea, it's something that is a master of the sea. It's able to move through the sea, and it lives in the depths of the sea. So it has deep memory of the ancient past. As well, the goat aspect of it can begin to climb quite high in the sky through terrains that are quite difficult. And so you'll see also a very future-oriented sense of this, or a goal-oriented, a climbing-oriented sense of this sign. As such, people with strong Capricorn influences often either have a very deep interest in the esoteric hidden past. They might be interested in histories that have been misplaced. They might be interested in societies from the ancient world that disappeared. As well, very many of them have an interest in building something tangible in the present to future world. And very often, people have both of these interests simultaneously at play in various combinations. Now, Capricorn is ruled by the planet Saturn, which rules over boundaries. Now, this is both the challenging aspect of boundaries, right? Like when we have an obstacle to overcome, or we have to put in very difficult, hard work to find something finally take shape. And also the very pleasant form of boundaries, the idea that we're redirected when stumbling blocks enter our paths in particular directions, or the idea that we want some boundaries, including the boundaries of the body. And the boundaries of the body are ruled by Capricorn. We have the skeletal system, especially the knees, and the skin of the body. So your inner structure, which is your bones, and your outer structure, which is your skin. We also find that there's a focus in Capricorn in the body on longevity. So this idea that the bones will outlast any other piece of our bodies or our forms. Now, Mars is also exalted here, and Mars is a planet of action. And I think this is very interesting because Mars in action, for example, in a fire sign will move very quickly, and an air sign will move quickly, and a water sign will evoke strong emotional output. But in Capricorn has a steady directionality about it, has a steadiness that maybe doesn't quite appear in other signs, and has an intentionality behind it. And so Mars finds his point of exaltation. And actually, as I'm recording this right now, the day after the winter solstice, Mars is in Capricorn. And so we have this moment of exaltation. Now, Capricorn is associated with two tarot cards. Capricorn itself is associated with the Devil card, and Saturn itself is associated with the World Dancer card. And these are very different cards in a certain sense, and there are some notable continuations between the two that are worth noting. But before I get into that, I thought I'd just help people out, because I think if you're not deeply entrenched in tarot studies and you see the Devil card, you'll think to yourself, that is a very scary card and I do not like it. However, there's a lot of symbolism in this card, which can really open some pathways to understanding this energy. So in the Devil card, you'll see pictured a devil-like figure encased in darkness, with a man and a woman, typically nude and containing elements in their figures that are somewhat bestial. So you'll see often they have cloven-hooved feet instead of your typical human feet. They'll have horns, they'll have tails, but they will be chained to what the devil figure is seated on, which is a half cube. Now, all of this is super relevant. The two nude beings represent your consciousness, your self-consciousness, and your subconsciousness. And they represent a form which is a little bit tied to what would have been considered in the past your lower, quote unquote, animalistic nature. So you see these people are tied to a very materialist view of the world, where we sort of what you see is what you get because we have a human body. That means we are animalistic in some sense, though there's much symbolism here to suggest that actually isn't the case. They're also encased in chains that actually are pretty loose, that they could get out of if they just lifted it. And when you look at the devil figure itself, you'll see that it's an androgen in a certain way, so both genders, but it's split through a vertical line. So it's split down the middle, which is significant because the other two times we see an androgynous being, so a being with both genders in the tarot, we have the Fool card, where the character as the Fool is shown as a youth, and it's understood that that character is both genders, but not through the vertical line split, through embodying the fullness of both. Likewise, and this is a key similarity to the World Dancer card, you'll see that that character is also both genders, but again, not through the middle split, which indicates duality and separateness, but through the integration of both. So that's a key thing I always like to point out. So the Devil card, there's a bit of confusion. He's not integrated as both. He hasn't integrated his male and female aspects, his subconscious and conscious aspects. And he has the evil symbol of the upside down pentagram. So the right side up pentagram represents the fifth element, the Akash, the ethers, right, ruling over the other four elements. When upside down, it indicates a materialist view of the world, which is sort of like indicating that spirit has no say. It's the material world that's in charge. It's sort of like if you study these systems, you really hope that's not the case. And so this devil figure represents an inversion. And specifically, he doesn't represent an inversion necessarily of all that we see in the world, but rather of how we ourselves interpret the world. And this is a key thing with all Capricorn energy is, are you interpreting the world correctly? You'll see the devil figure is like also an amalgamation of animals. He has chicken legs and bat wings and a goat head and a human torso. And he's on a half cube, which represents a halfway, a partial understanding, not a fully inaccurate understanding, but just a partial understanding of what reality truly is. And so in this card, we see a lot of clues that are suggesting that this card shows how we interpret the world when we have misinterpreted the world. This card also suggests that we are to actually laugh when we misinterpret things instead of get all up in arms about it or take it too seriously. Because in the devil card, if you actually flipped on the lights, you would see he's sort of a ridiculous figure with his chicken legs on his half block, that the people are actually not chained, and that if they maybe had a little joviality, also associated with the winter solstice traditionally, that they could free themselves from this situation. So we have that. But then we have Saturn, the ruler of Capricorn, and this is such a key thing, is the World card is the crowning jewel of this tarot path. It is the final card, and it represents this capacity to be in the world, so in the Saturnian principle, the boundaries of the world, but not entrapped by it. You'll see this world dancer who again has both genders, representing the integration of our conscious and subconsciousness, fully embodied together, dancing in a way where they are no longer bound by the cycles of experience as viewed from a materialist view of external perspectives are just what you see is what you get, and instead is free within any circumstance in which they find themselves. So that's the gist of what I wanted to say. I could go on and on about this. I'll try to cease my comments at this point. I'm sure you and Michelle have plenty to add on these topics. But yeah, just a lot of gratitude for all the work you guys are doing. And I hope you are having a beautiful holiday season and start to your 2026 calendar year.
Okay, Emily Ridout, thank you for an excellent voicemail. Once again, she's always bringing it, and I just love her perspective on things. So she started off the voicemail by saying that Capricorn is one of the more misunderstood signs, which is a total theme that we're unpacking here today.
Yes.
This distortion or misunderstanding about what it represents. And so she is on board with that. She understands that. And I love the fact that she brought up the World card as it relates to Saturn and is ruled by Saturn. Absolutely. There's a lot of things going on there that we could get into. But there are a few things that she mentioned about the Devil card that I thought were maybe a little more pertinent, at least from my perspective. And I just appreciate what she was saying about the devil being related to inversion. And the way I would explain this to somebody is really symbolically, spiritually, metaphysically, the most evil thing you could do is be ignorant of self and who you really are. And if you're not inquiring about who you are and how you relate to the cosmos, and the oneness of all and things like that, you're actually going to be ignorant of the real truth of the matter, in that you are a divine creature. You're a divine person. You have a physical body, but you are spiritual in essence. So to me, the devil in many ways represents basically ignorance of self, right? And so that to me is like one of the big takeaways. And that's why there's an inversion sort of going on, or that's why I think he's associated with this sort of distortion. The truth of the matter is that you are more whole and complete and divine than you realize. And if you are not asking about that, and if you're not looking into that side of things, you basically are believing the lie. The more you ignore your higher nature, the more you're going to succumb to your lower nature. And I think that this is one of the other takeaways with this card. So what she said here was, are you interpreting the world correctly? That is absolutely huge, because depending on how accurately you can see the world, that's going to make a world of difference with how you perceive literally everything. And so if there's, I'll say, separation and division in your heart, and you are wholly focused on the material side of things and whatnot, versus the holistic side of things, the clearer your internal landscape is, the clearer your external landscape is going to be. So if you have an inner landscape that is undeveloped or not explored, then you're going to see things externally as such, essentially, is how I would like to say it. So are you interpreting the world correctly? I love the fact that she said that. And also, the goat relates to vision. If you look at old bestiaries, these are like old animal dictionaries. They often emphasize the powerful vision of the goat. And so this makes a lot of sense because of their climbing ability. And so if they're high up the mountain, they want to see what's happening down below. So this concept of vision and clarity really comes to mind, because also the devil card corresponds with the Hebrew letter ayin, which literally means eye.
Ah.
So there's a lot going on there. And then I've said this before too, we have the sea goat, S-E-A, as in the ocean, but then phonetically it sounds like sea goat, as in vision. And so there's a whole entire thing going on there.
Well, this also makes me think of the eye of the beholder, which goes along with, are you interpreting the world correctly, or how do you see the world? Which also then rolls into the thought of, or the belief, or the knowing that you are in control and you are the ruler of your own world and of your own life. And so that's another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to what Kristine said earlier about the internal orientation,
right?
Internal clarity, and all these things affecting what's happening externally.
And to expand on the external, I wanted to talk about the skin, because that has been brought up as one of the parts of the body that is ruled by Capricorn. And one of the things I've learned over the years and from personal experience is that one of the best minerals and or supplements that you can use for your skin is sulfur. And the sulfur that I use internally is MSM sulfur. So this isn't the yellow sulfur, the raw element of sulfur. This is a refined version of sulfur that can be taken safely internally and used externally. And it's also the cousin to DMSO, dimethyl sulfoxide, which I've also talked about before in other shows. But the thing with sulfur, too, is that it's usually connected to the devil and or the realms of hell. And that hell is supposed to smell like sulfur. And that, to me, makes a lot of sense with what it can do, because the thing that sulfur does for the skin is that it helps to build collagen and keratin. And these two things within your body, they improve the elasticity and the firmness, and as well as the hydration of your skin. And as we age and get older, it becomes a bigger priority to make sure our skin is healthy. And when we look at how sulfur contributes to the health of our skin, what it also does, it can help reduce the signs of aging. So with that comes wrinkles and maybe redness and dark spots, or what some people will call age spots. Now, isn't it funny that Capricorn is kind of all about the old and the elder and things like this. Whereas sulfur, which is associated with the devil, is actually kind of like an antidote to how the skin ages. Now, I'm a firm believer in wrinkles and the importance of them. So I'm not necessarily interested in anti-aging formulas and ways to make yourself look younger, because I think that as a natural process, we're supposed to lean into these things, but there are things that we can do to make the process more smooth. And that is why I wanted to bring up the sulfur.
Yeah, right. Aging gracefully.
Yes, there you go.
Excellent stuff. I love the sulfur connection here between the skin and what people associate with hell. Fire, brimstone, sulfur, that's all common stuff. I also wanted to mention the half cube that the devil is sitting on or squatting on. In the Rider-Waite deck, you can see that he's squatting on, it kind of looks like the monolith from 2001, A Space Odyssey. But just the fact that there is a ton of cube symbolism, specifically black cube symbolism, that gets associated with Saturn. And so it's a whole deep weave. There's all sorts of things kind of associated with it. There's black cubes around the world. People say that this is associated with Saturn or Saturnian worship. There's a hexagonal design on one of the poles of Saturn. The hexagon is related to the cube. It's six-sided. And so there's just a ton of things going on there. So for people who are interested, that's a rabbit hole you can go down if you want to learn more about it.
Hi, everybody. Happy Capricorn season. My name is Allie. Online, I am known as the Cosmic Space Witch. I'm a professional astrology with a galactic and esoteric twist. I want to talk about Capricorn from a galactic esoteric perspective. It's a sign that is somewhat misunderstood. Or not really misunderstood, but only one side of it is usually discussed, and that's its, earthly material aspect. And Capricorn has profound esoteric symbolism that I don't believe is discussed enough. We know that, Scorpio governs the occult, it governs the esoteric, and it has this evolutionary journey where it evolves from the scorpion to the eagle, where it can see from a higher perspective. And then that eagle goes through a death and rebirth, and it's reborn as the phoenix, able to, see from a spiritual lens. Capricorn has an esoteric journey as well that is not as well known. And I want to kind of talk about that a little bit. We know that Capricorn governs the top of the chart, right? It governs the midheaven, the 10th house, our mission, our purpose. And a lot of times Capricorn gets caught up in the material aspect of things, capitalism and material success, worldly treasures, striving the corporate ladder, or things like that. But what Capricorn is ultimately striving towards is a connection to its divinity, is a connection to God, is a connection to what it means to be spiritually pure, and the true ascent up the mountain, which is a spiritual one. Now, much like Scorpio, that has this narrative where it evolves from lower consciousness to higher consciousness, from the scorpion to the phoenix, Capricorn has this too. Capricorn's esoteric symbol is that of the unicorn. We know about the mountain goat, we know about the sea goat, we know about the importance of climbing up that mountain, the mountain goat, and diving to the depths, the sea goat. But not a lot of people know that Capricorn's esoteric symbol is the unicorn. There's actually two signs that are associated with the unicorn, and it's Capricorn and its opposing sign, Cancer, which is where the unicorn constellation falls in tropical Cancer. Now, we have the exoteric, I don't know why it's so hard for me to say that, I am an esoteric astrologer, but the exoteric association is that mountain goat or that sea goat that is really kind of navigating the material world or the emotional depths And then we have the esoteric association, which is the unicorn, which represents that higher octave of Capricorn. It is traveling not the material world, but the spiritual world. And it's ascending up that mountaintop of ascension, right? Of spiritual development. And it's embodying that ascended self, that self that is on a mission, that has a purpose, and it understands that the true purpose and the true mission is not material, it is not capitalistic, it is not earthly per se, it is a divine ascension up to the top of our personal mountain, right? And yes, it has a lot to do with ambition and transcending, but it's transcending into those heights of spiritual awareness. Okay. All right. So there are two other things that I want to kind of touch on that I find really interesting about Capricorn. And that is the concept of Capricorn as a feminine sign. You know, Taurus and Capricorn kind of get a lot of like masculine attributes associated with them because of Taurus being associated with the bull. But if you go back far enough, it was really a cow, like a very fertile cow that just so happened to have horns because bovine have horns. And then later this was misinterpreted to being a masculine bull, but it's an earth sign, it's a feminine sign. And it was, you know, a sign of fertility. And it used to be a bovine, you know. And then we have Capricorn being associated, of course, ruled by Saturn, and Saturn being like the daddy planet of the zodiac. And so Capricorn gets these like masculine attributes. And a lot of times it's attributed to, you know, Saturn or Kronos as this like authoritarian figure. And I always like to remind my clients that Saturn and Capricorn, yes, on one hand, there is this authoritarian, dominating essence about it that is very Kronos. But then there is also this wise, earthly, motherly aspect about it. And in some systems of thought, the 10th house is not the house of the father, it's rather the house of the mother. But I like to associate it with the crone. So I always say that Saturn and Capricorn is either Kronos or the crone, depending on what era of your life you're in and how you work with these energies. There's a lot of wisdom to be obtained in Capricorn and on our way up to the top of our personal mountain, right? I also like to point out that, you know, Saturn in traditional Western astrology is a masculine planet. But in Vedic astrology, it's neutral, like Mercury, where it is neither masculine nor feminine, which I like because Capricorn governs both. Saturn governs both the earth sign of Capricorn and the air sign of Aquarius, which is a masculine sign and a feminine sign. And so it makes sense that it would be neutral, right? But I always like to remind people that Capricorn, while we do have this like daddy lens with which to look at this sign, it's an earth sign and it's deeply feminine and it's really rooted in a lot of that like earthly wisdom. And then the last thing I want to touch on here is, I believe, the most important fixed star that falls inside of tropical Capricorn, and that is Vega Lyra. Lyra is the harp constellation in mythology. It is Apollo's harp. So it's a constellation that's associated with prophecy and divination. It's also the harp that Orpheus uses when he goes down into the underworld to save his wife. And he uses it to put Cerberus, the three-headed dog, to sleep. We see the same motif in Harry Potter because Harry Potter is just a bunch of Greek mythology retold. And it's the harp that puts Fluffy, the three-headed dog, to sleep so that he can get down into the under part of the school and go about his quest to get the Philosopher's Stone. The harp is associated with art and music and creativity and prophecy and divination and the ability to tame the beast within so that we can get down into the treasures of what is beneath. And the star is super profound because it used to be the pole star. So Vega Lyra was the pole star about 12,000 to 14,000 years ago during our like pre-Diluvian world, like during the time leading up to what's believed to have been the Great Flood, the Younger Dryas impact, and the like rising of our sea levels. And so this star was our pole star, our sacred center, our source of all life during the last world, the pre-Diluvian world. And it will be a pole star again because of the wobble of the Earth's axis. Pole stars rotate, and Vega Lyra actually did a better job of being the pole star than Polaris because Vega is very bright. It's very easy to see. Polaris is not easy to see. It's not really the best pole star for us to have in regards to navigating and finding our way, whether it be spiritually or literally out to sea or something like that. But Vega was and will be again. I also find it interesting that Vega falls exactly opposite Sirius. So Sirius falls at the middle of Cancer and Vega falls in the middle of Capricorn. And so if you have planets aligned with one of those stars, they're aligned with the other. And I always say that Sirius is associated with spiritual initiation. It's the brightest star in our night sky. It helps to pull us out of our own sun, our own solar system, our own identity and ego, and into cosmic consciousness. It's the guardian of the mysteries, the guardian of the veil, and it starts to pull us out into a more expansive cosmic understanding. And then opposite that is Vega Lyra, which helps us to tame the beast within so that we can reach those spiritual depths. And it helps us to do that through art and music and creativity and divination and tapping into our psychic senses and that psychic dimension. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. If you found this interesting and you would like to book a reading with me, you can find me at thecosmicspacewitch.com or on Instagram, The Cosmic Space Witch. I have sessions where I go really deep into the archetypal dynamics of fixed stars and asteroids and black holes. And yeah, thank you for having me, Mario. And I wish everybody a very merry Capricorn season. Bye-bye.
Okay, Allie, aka the Cosmic Space Witch, coming through with another voicemail. Very cool, great stuff. There's a few things that stuck out, obviously. One of them being the esoteric journey of Capricorn, her relating that to Scorpio, and it's well known that Scorpio has 3 emanations or expressions with the scorpion, serpent, and eagle/phoenix. Here she's saying that there's a similar sort of thing going on with Capricorn, which I've never heard people make that comparison, but that's pretty interesting. And also the fact that she sees Saturn as being a neutral planet, not necessarily masculine or feminine, but androgynous, just like Mercury, is also very intriguing. I don't know if I've ever heard that before. And one of the things she was saying here is, you know, the fact that it rules Aquarius, an air sign, and then Capricorn, which is an earth sign. And I think that's something I want to chew on a little bit, but I can see what she's saying. And I think that this is an interesting sort of dynamic at play because we have been talking about how, of course, a lot of people see it as being masculine. A lot of people see it as being feminine. And so really, is it both? You know, is it somewhere in the middle and that it's kind of like a middle path planet, right? And so obviously that's for you to decide or ponder. Also, the fact that she brought up the unicorn, so glad she brought that up. I made a video about the unicorn being related to Cancer, which she said that that's also applicable. But really, she's saying that it's related to this polarity axis, right, between Capricorn and Cancer. And I did mention Capricorn, I believe, in that video as well, that the unicorn is generally associated with both. It makes a lot of sense. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, and it makes sense that it's related to both Cancer and Capricorn as they are the polar opposites of each other on the zodiacal wheel. And yes, to go further into the unicorn, this is one of the things that was in the Zodiac and the Salts of Salvation in the Capricorn section that really intrigued me because they also talk about the unicorn. And in relation to the unicorn, they say, It is employed to signify or represent support. Its horn, containing, as it does, a central cavity, which must be filled with marrow or oil, is similar to the spinal vertebrae, which also contains a central cavity. These vertebrae are also of the nature of a support, as the backbone is the support of the torso. One having no character is said to have no backbone. This, to me, says a lot. And then there's another quote that I have about the unicorn, and it says, "The horn of the unicorn thus contains the anointing oil." So that, in and of itself, and with all the stuff with Saturn, was very intriguing to me. So I'm really glad Allie went there.
Yeah, and what I said in my unicorn Cancer video is that the horn of the unicorn is another world axis symbol, essentially. So there's polar symbolism associated with it. And to me, the fact that the solstices have been viewed as a pole as well, traditionally,
right,
is also very interesting. The equinoxes as well. And so there's a lot going on here, including the fact that I brought up earlier that corn really means horn. So unicorn, right, relates to that horn there. So that's really cool that she brought that to the table.
I wanted to spitball a little bit on her commentary on the faintness of the North Star.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree with her. It's strange that that is one of the faintest stars in the cosmos, but it is used for navigation, and it's actually kind of challenging to find if you don't know how to find it. But I guess to play devil's advocate a little bit, one of the things it made me think of is that on the path to finding your true north, as you've talked about many times, it's a challenging path. It's not supposed to be easy. And I wonder if symbolically that's one of the reasons why it's a faint star, is that it's not supposed to be out bright in your face. And the journey to your true north, it's often not talked about in the ways that we like to talk about it and how important it is. We're not taught these things from young ages usually. We usually have to find this stuff on our own. And so it kind of just further illustrates the challenge that lies in this sort of choice of lifestyle. And I think that it kind of just illustrates further why the appearance is faint and not easy to see.
Yeah, no, I can see your point. And if the pole star changes, I've mentioned this before, that I'm meeting more and more people who do not think the pole star changes.
Interesting.
And of course, most people see it that there is this change of pole star and there's lists out there and everything else. And so whether it changes or doesn't, it almost doesn't matter to me in some ways. If it changes, I've said this before as well, but that it's more like a title, that the pole star is like a title for whatever star is closest to that axis point. And so it's almost like a king, how an empire will have a king until they get beheaded or die or whatever the thing is, but that the kingship is kind of like a title for whoever is occupying the throne at that time, right? And so maybe if the pole star changes and we are currently living in a faint pole star reality in this age, it's emblematic or symbolic of everything you just said, that actually in this age, in the modern age, in the dark age, that finding your center, going to that still point within, finding your true north, etc., is actually going to be more difficult versus maybe in ages a long time ago, the golden age, if you will, that perhaps the pole star was brighter because enlightenment, your own personal awakening, etc., was actually more easily attainable because of the society that you found yourself in.
Yes.
Also, just have to say, some people have suggested that Saturn may have been the original pole star.
Oh.
And that it got moved further out. Related to that, also, that Saturn was perhaps the original sun and then basically aged, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, and got pushed out, becoming, at least in the traditional system, the furthest planet out, the slowest lumbering furthest planet out. So 2 considerations there. Original sun or original pole star. Just something to think about.
Duality is an unexpected facet of Capricorn's symbolic character. Firstly, in that it covers the last and the first months of the calendar year, respectively. It is December and it is January. It is death and it is birth. It is old and it is young. Capricorn seems to embody or seems to suggest, just within its own position within the year, the eternal youth and the senex, like Peter Pan and Captain Hook, something that is very, very old and something that is very, very wise and something that is very, very experienced, coupled with something that is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly new and fresh and young. And that within itself is suggestive of the life narrative we see for Kronos Saturn as depicted in myth, who is also at once, again, this issue of duality. He is Father Time, but he is also the Grim Reaper. The iconography for the two are identical. They're the same. We just don't image them the same in our common parlance. The most important shared element between the two, the sickle or the scythe, the symbol of the harvest. Kronos Saturn is an agricultural deity, ultimately. Time being the rhythms and cycles of nature and the succession of the seasons. He is, at the end of the day, an earthy god, just as Capricorn is an earthy sign. According to Hesiod, Kronos Saturn is the wily, youngest, and most terrible of Gaia, Mother Earth's children. Which, again, shows that shared image of Kronos Saturn, who we know as old Father Time, as the Grim Reaper. He is the youngest of his siblings. But he is also the most fearless and perhaps the most murderously ambitious, for he enacts his mother's vengeance. He castrates his father, seizes the throne, and devours his own children to avoid reprisal. Yet his reign is called the Golden Age in Greek myth. We see classic Capricornian traits of ambition, drive, tenacity, and ruthlessness to maintain supremacy. And ultimately, this brings us right back to the beginning. This conflict or this confluence of the young and the old that is so particularly peculiar about Capricorn as a sign. Thank you so much for your consideration. My name is Tom. You may find me on Instagram at tmackey1018. That is T, M as in Mary, ACKY1018. Or you may find some of my other thoughts regarding mythology and astrology at www.quora.com/profile/Tom- MAC, M as in Mary, A as in Apple, C as in Cat, -69.
All right. Thank you, Tom, for the submission. He's been on a few times before. And basically, just to highlight the main sort of sentiment, I think, regarding this old and young dynamic with Capricorn, it is pretty interesting when you think about it. I mean, we were talking about the fact that young goats are called kids, and that's what we refer to children as kids. And then we have the dynamic of Saturn eating its child. And also, I just want to highlight with this, the old and young kind of being at play or at odds with each other. There are some older alchemical illustrations where Saturn is cutting off the legs of Mercury. And this could be really unpacked at length. Tracy Twyman actually is the first person that kind of brought that to my attention. I believe it was her book, Solomon's Treasure, that really got into this dynamic. And it has to do with the elder preying on the youth. And Mercury is a youthful, young person. Generally, when Mercury Hermes is depicted, they almost have like a runner's body. And so they are the messengers of the gods, or he is the messenger of the gods. He is a traveler. He's going to and fro. So to have his legs cut off, obviously, is a pretty big deal. And she was actually relating it to the economy and how the economy works and how the older generations kind of rely on the younger generations to kind of keep everything going. And symbolically, in some ways, they need the energy of the youth in order to maintain their wealth and to continue growing it and everything else. The same way someone who owns a mega corporation, you know, they have to rely on the new recruits and the younger generation to actually do some of the manual labor or whatever needs to be done, right? So that's the main thing I wanted to say is look into that if you're interested in more of this dynamic, that this is also in play with Saturn and Mercury. And with Saturn, you have the longest cycle, 27 years or what have you, versus Mercury having an 88-day cycle. And so Saturn clearly represents the elderly, and then Mercury, in this case, represents a youthful dynamic. And coming up, we have a couple of voicemails from Julian.
I will speak of alchemy and crosses in the context of Capricorn. Look at the analemma to learn why sun gods are born in Capricorn. After reaching Capricorn's tropic, the sun rises north again to Polaris. On this day at midnight, the sun is at the lowest point of the natal chart, connecting to the humble origin of a god born as the least among men, seen in Jesus, born in a manger. With the sun at the IC, Virgo the Virgin rules the ascendant, thus giving birth to the Son of God, both S-O-N and S-U-N. The greeting for the son's birthday, Merry Christmas, also contains a homophone, his mother's name, thereby uniting the feminine virgin Mary with the masculine son Christ in Mary Christmas, a woman man. A biblical metaphor for Jesus is bridegroom, another woman man, showing that he weds together or marries opposites within himself and is whole, or holy. If the sun is born in Capricorn, then conception was 9 months prior in Aries the ram, or Lamb of God. The zodiac begins in Aries and ends in Pisces the fish, but the beginning and end of the sun is in Capricorn. Thus we see these animals there united in one symbol, the sea goat. Plus, if Jesus is a ram and his symbol the fish, is he also not a sea goat? The phrase, turn lead into gold, asks us to do the same and describes Saturn, ruler of lead, becoming gold, the sweat of the sun, describing the sun's path from tropic to tropic. This alchemical marriage is also called the Hieros Gamos, recalling the Hierophant, whose papal cross has 3 horizontal bars, again signifying the 2 tropics, with the equator in the middle. The bars form a triangle or mountain shape on the pole, and the longest being on the bottom mimics the analemma. But a cross in Satan's home? Capricorn is the 10th sign of the zodiac. Did you know the Chinese character for the number 10 is a cross, and in Japanese the cross is pronounced Ju? Also, the Roman numeral for 10 is a saltire, a tilted cross. In addition to the Christian cross, whose intersection mirrors the location where the analemma intersects itself, the Egyptian Ankh merges the eternal feminine loop with the phallic vertical pole at the horizontal crossbar of the material plane where they meet. Finally, there's the Mariner's Cross, which features an anchor at the bottom. Is it a coincidence that anchor, ankh, is essentially ankh, anchor? Roman and ancient anchors relied on lead to keep ships safely moored and fixed, not drifting away. I propose this seafaring cross to be the best glyph for Capricorn, given how it fuses the stabilizing lead anchor, whose home is the ocean floor, with the ever-ascending golden sun seen in the perfect circle at the top of the cross. My Chinese friend who studies medicine is shy to record herself in English, so please allow me to relay her thoughts on cell salts, plants, and herbs. Capricorn cell salt is calcium phosphate, fitting given that both calcium and phosphorus are crucial minerals for bones, a body part ruled by the sign, and foods rich in these minerals are leafy greens and root vegetables, all enjoyed by goats. Abbreviated, the cell salt is CaPO, all letters in the word Capricorn and even its first syllables, capo, recorn. Even crabs, opposite on the zodiacal wheel, use calcium phosphate in areas requiring extra strength and durability, like in their claws and jaws. The cell salt is also used to protect crabs' corneal lenses, which happen to be hexagonal, the same 6-sided shape, appearing on Saturn, whose domicile is Capricorn. Their lenses refract light, and just like how the sun that is reborn in Capricorn creates a rainbow when it is refracted, pansies, the Capricornian flower, come in every color of the rainbow. Now on the topic of flowers and plants, horsetail and bamboo are both ruled by Capricorn, being stable, tenacious, and resilient, and they both feature a Saturnian signature of rings all along their tall stalks. Both plants are rich in silica, good for bones, nails, and hair. Silica is the cell salt of Sagittarius the horse, which horsetail has in abundance. Another Sagittarian named herb is Epimedium sagittatum, known by the more common name horny goatweed. Legend says a Chinese goat herder observed his flock becoming unusually sexually active after grazing on the plant, so it's been known as yin-yang hua in traditional Chinese medicine, given its association with vigor and reproductive health, a core concept in yin-yang balance. The herb is used to cure impotence and joint pain, but also to balance bodily energies and tonify the kidneys. Interesting, given that the kidneys are ruled by Libra, the scales of balance, and the only sign where Saturn exalts. Further, Cancer's glyph is a modified yin-yang, and where the sun is highest in the sky. Does God's sun require horny goatweed to rise all the way up to its maximum height? The primary active flavonoid in horny goatweed is icarin, a name eerily similar to Icarus, the man who perished for flying too close to the sun. Fortunately for goats, even when they ascend above the clouds, they always stay grounded, but you will often find them licking rocks on capricious cliffs to get essential salts and minerals, which are plentiful in the waters where crabs dwell. So even as the goat towers over the world, it requires the depth of the sea to summit the peak.
All right, Julian, thank you so much for those voicemails. There were a lot of correspondences here in a very short amount of time. Really interesting stuff, but I know there's a couple things that piqued your interest, right?
Oh, yes. Well, I was so glad that he included what his friend wanted to talk about with the plants and the cell salts themselves. And as soon as he said horsetail and bamboo, I thought to myself, yes, because horsetail is one of the more interesting and intriguing plants that I have been able to find in nature in terms of. Some people say that horsetail is like one of the oldest plants, or sometimes I've even heard people refer to it as like a fossil, which I think is really interesting. And that there's myths that the horsetail were like super gigantic at one point, and now are shrunk down. But in certain regions, particularly in areas where we live around water, you can find very large horsetail. So that's something that kind of pings me again with the whole elder weave of Saturn. And the other thing, too, that comes to mind is what I was talking about again with sulfur, and then the connection with horsetail and bamboo being really great for hair, skin, and nails. So all three of these elements, or the two plants along with the sulfur, just being really wonderful for those parts of the body.
Yeah, that's really interesting with horsetail. Now that you say it, it does look prehistoric. Although that's not something that I had thought about before. And you do generally see it, at least where we live, where earth meets water.
Yes, great point.
So this relates to Capricorn, obviously being an actual earth sign, but having this oceanic aquatic dynamic with it.
One of the other things about horsetail that makes me think about what Allie mentioned with the potential for Saturn to be a neutral planet is the fertile and the sterile split with horsetail. So there's actually a fertile shoot, which is known sometimes as the male horsetail. And this one is just a straight shoot that has a cone on top. And that cone actually will produce spores.
Ah, very phallic.
Yes, it's very phallic. And the spores are like a blue color. And you can kind of walk past the horsetail at a certain point and kind of just flick them, and those spores will be distributed. And this one does not have any branches, while the sterile shoot, which is the female horsetail, this one grows taller and it comes in after that first shoot, and it has branches on it, and there's no cone on the top. And this one will grow throughout the season, whereas the fertile shoot will die back once those spores are released.
Really interesting. And just have to say, Allie also brought up the unicorn, a horse, and then now we're talking about horsetail.
Ah, right.
And so it's just come up a couple of times today. And, I'm always keeping track of these things.
And then the horsetail being the back end of the horse, the tail being the back, and then the horn of the unicorn being up front, or the goats, or whatever horned gods we're talking about, really.
Right. Yes, exactly. All right, everyone, that's going to do it for this episode on Capricorn symbolism. Hopefully you got something out of that. I had a great time. I hope you did too.
Yes, I did.
And we'll see you soon for an episode on the symbolism of Aquarius. Okay, this concludes the live recording Michelle and I made on Tuesday, December 30th. What a solid episode that was. If there was anything I wish I would have mentioned symbolically, it's something that I have written here in my notebook that says Saturn and technology. This is a huge topic to unpack, but I'll give you the gist of it right here. To me, there's an undeniable connection that technology has with the ring planet. In fact, a lot of our modern tech, to me, looks very Saturnian. I'm thinking of all the black screens we have in our living rooms and elsewhere, the black phones that we carry around with us that have these black screens, and just in general, all of the black electronics from, gaming systems to speakers and whatnot. We even talked about the black cube in the episode, and a lot of these electronic devices remind me of the black cube, including, again, just the rectangular square that we see everywhere. I see this as largely being thematic of Saturn, who's associated with the color black. I also see that the relationship Saturn has with boundaries and restrictions also relates to technology, being, a system. We have computer systems and software that runs on them, which is also systemic. And what really defines a system? It's actually its rules and boundaries. In other words, what really defines a system is actually its limitations. which, as we've talked about, is naturally very Saturnian. So just a little food for thought as we wrap up this episode. Obviously, with a topic as huge and massive as Saturn, we could go on and on. But with all of that said, as always, a huge thank you to everyone who submitted a voicemail for this episode. You guys really make it worth listening to, in my opinion. But an extra special thanks to our Symbolic Dream Team and the special guest we had today, Kristine Backes. I'm really grateful for all of you guys. Kristine Backes can be found at her site, KristineBackes.com. That's Backes, Backes, and also KristineBackes.substack.com. She also runs the Natural Wisdom podcast. Check that out. You can find that on most podcast platforms. Emily Ridout can be found at astroyoga.org or emilyridout.com. Sarah's Instagram can be found at Sarah_Henlin, and that's Sarah, SAHRA _Henlin, HENLIN, if you want to follow her posts. Katriena can be found at The Venus Diaries on Substack or at KatrienaEmmanuel.com. That's Katriena Emmanuel, EMMANUEL.com. Allie, the Cosmic Space Witch, can be found at thecosmicspacewitch.com and on Instagram, instagram.com/thecosmicspacewitch. Once again, in case you weren't aware, I am available for tarot readings, study sessions, and graphic design services. I say this all the time, but graphic design is how I actually found symbolism. If your project could use a symbolic consultant or creative, please let me know. As always, for exclusive content, head on over to patreon.com/symbolicstudies or symbolicstudies.com/secrets. Without a doubt, this is the best way to keep up with everything I have to offer, and it's just $5 a month. Links to all of my accounts online can be found at symbolicstudies.com. And that's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you next month with a show on the symbolism of Aquarius. Until then.